It's crazy how sometimes the most average-looking person can turn out to be capable of, well, really awful things. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, the case of John Peter Malveaux. We've got his Wikipedia page and a whole bunch of old newspaper articles. So, yeah, ready to kind of unpack this story of this, like, seemingly regular family man from Opelousas, Louisiana, who ended up being a serial killer.
Yeah, it's really, I think it's sort of fascinating how evil can be so ordinary. Melvaux had a wife and 6 kids and was considered to be really friendly and well respected in his community. Even some sources describe him as beloved, but there were also some mentions of problems with alcohol. But still, under that surface, he was responsible for the murders of at least 4 women between 1996 and 1997.
Wow, it's a case that really makes you question, like, what a criminal really looks like. So, going back to the beginning, can you tell us about his first confirmed victim?
Yeah, that would be Diane Sam, a 38-year-old woman. Malveaux, he sexually assaulted and strangled her, and he left her body at an apartment complex back in February of 1996. And this is something that we see a lot tragically with serial killers. They often target people they see as vulnerable.
And it sounds like his crimes continued after that.
Yes, sadly, in July of 1997, he murdered 2 more women, Carolyn Bro Nichols, who was 26, and Tammy Duplichin Smith. Both of them were raped and strangled, and their bodies were left in like isolated areas, kind of similar to what happened to Diane Sam. And this consistency in like his MO, the strangulation, the sexual assault, the specific way he got rid of the bodies, it paints a very clear picture of his mindset.
I mean, one thing I found really chilling was the story of a woman who actually survived his attack. I mean, he thought he had killed her after like a really brutal attack. He even went so far as to like stage her body, but she regained consciousness and was able to get away. The article I read described her eyes bleeding from like the force that he used. I mean, what can you tell us about like the psychology behind that level of brutality?
Yeah, it's a horrifying detail for sure. It speaks volumes about the level of violence that Melville was capable of. It suggests an attachment from the suffering that he was inflicting, which is very often something you see with serial offenders. It's really impossible to know for sure without a psychological evaluation. But that level of brutality, it could point to sadism, where the act of causing pain is actually part of the motivation.
That's a terrifying thought. So how did Melville's, like, I don't know, I guess reign of terror is what you'd call it. How did that end?
Well, it ended in November of 1997, and kind of unexpectedly, the police found him asleep in Tammy Duplichin Smith's stolen car. And then what happened next is even more interesting. He confessed to all 4 murders.
Wow, he just confessed.
Yeah, he did. And not only did he confess, but he also revealed really specific details about Diane Sam's death, details that only the killer would have known. So, from a legal standpoint, a confession like that is very valuable. I mean, there's no doubt about his guilt.
So sounds like a pretty open and shut case. What happened next?
Well, he was tried and convicted in St. Landry Parish for the murders of Diane Sam, Carolyn Bro Nichols, and Tammy Guplichin Smith. He received 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Okay, and what about the fourth murder?
Yeah, so that's where things get a bit more complicated. Tammy Duplicin Smith, she was actually murdered in Evangeline Parish, so he was tried separately there. He ended up getting a 4th life sentence, also without parole, for that crime. It's interesting. He was eligible for the death penalty in both parishes, but instead he accepted a plea deal.
Wow, that really brings up some interesting questions about, like, the legal system, doesn't it? I mean, when is a plea deal the right thing to do in cases like this? Was justice actually served? We'll have to dig into that a bit later. But first, there's one more thing that I found really unsettling. The articles I was reading said that Malveaux was also investigated for other crimes, but none of them were ever actually connected to him.
Yeah, that's what I think is one of the most disturbing parts of cases like this. The possibility that there are other victims out there, more lives that were tragically cut short. And even with a confession, you never really know the full extent of a serial killer's crimes. And then, of course, there's always that big question, why? What could have driven a seemingly regular guy like John Peter Malveaux to do such horrible
It's
things?
a question that I think really needs some deeper exploration. We know the who, what, and when, but the why is still a mystery. So what kind of things do, criminologists think about when they were trying to understand the motivations of a serial killer?
Well, there's not an easy answer. Every case is unique and complex. But you do start to see some commonalities when you look at the research, like childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, certain personality disorders. All of those things can contribute to a really distorted worldview and a decreased ability to empathize. And then, of course, you also have to consider things like substance abuse, which can really lower inhibitions and kind of fuel those violent impulses.
Sounds like I don't know, a perfect storm of sorts, like a bunch of internal things and external pressures that can just push somebody down this dark path.
Exactly. It's very rarely just one thing, but it's more like a combination of things that shape how someone develops and ultimately what they end up doing.
So let's dig into those factors a little more. I'm really curious about Malveau's drinking problem and the role that might have played in his crimes. Do you think alcohol could have been like the trigger that unleashed this dark side of him?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. We know that alcohol, it lowers inhibitions and impairs judgment. So it can make people more likely to be aggressive or take risks. So, whether it was the actual cause or just made things worse that were already there, it's really hard to say for sure with what we know.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was also curious about something else I read in these articles. Apparently there was some, like, tension between Malveaux and his local church. Could that have played a part in all of this?
Oh, that's an interesting point. I mean, sometimes, yeah, when someone's disconnected from those support systems in the community, including spiritual ones, it can definitely have an impact on on how their life turns out. It's hard to know for sure if this was like a cause of his crimes or just a result of the darkness that was already there. But it does make you think about how important those community support networks can be. How they can maybe prevent those negative behaviors from happening in the first place.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about the people who knew him, the people he was around every day. Were there any signs, like anything that people maybe missed?
Right, that's the question everyone always asks, isn't it? Like, what were the warning signs? Did we miss any chances to stop this? But, the truth is that a lot of serial killers are really good at hiding who they really are. They blend in, they seem normal, they can even be charming. And the things we have don't really mention any specific red flags, but that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't there. Maybe the people close to him didn't see them. Or maybe they chose to ignore them. Maybe they just couldn't believe it or were too scared to say anything.
It's a scary reminder that these people can be really good at tricking everyone. Okay, let's move on to something else. Malveau's decision to accept a plea deal, and many didn't get the death penalty, but was justice really served?
Right, the plea deal, it's definitely one of the most complex ethical issues in the legal system, especially in cases where such horrible crimes have been committed. On the one hand, you have people saying that a plea deal makes sure that things get resolved quickly, that the victims' families don't have to go through a long and drawn-out trial, and that, it guarantees a conviction, and it also saves the state a lot of time and money.
So it's about being efficient and making sure there's closure for everyone involved.
Exactly. But then you have the other side, the people who say that a plea deal, especially when it means avoiding the death penalty, well, they say it feels like a compromise. Like the person who did these things isn't really being held accountable for how bad they were. Some people even see it as putting what the system needs ahead of real justice for the victims and their families.
Yeah, it's tough. You have to balance the practical side of things with the emotional and moral weight of these crimes.
Right, exactly. There's no easy answer. And every case is different. In Malveau's case, the plea deal meant he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never be able to hurt anyone again. But was that enough? That's something everyone has to decide for themselves.
Yeah, it's definitely something you keep thinking about even after everything is over in court. There's this other really interesting thing about this case. Malveaux was the first serial killer, like officially documented in St. Landry Parish history.
Yeah, that's what a lot of the articles at the time said. It really captured people's attention, the idea that this kind of evil could happen right in their own community.
It makes you wonder, though, were there other cases before this? Cases that people didn't realize were connected? Or maybe they explained them away somehow?
I mean, it's possible serial killers can operate for a long time without being noticed. Their crimes just blend in with everything else that's going on. It's also possible that the methods they used to investigate crimes back then weren't as good. So it was harder to see the connections between murders that seemed unrelated. Like maybe they didn't have DNA testing as easily back then, so that could have played a role.
So maybe there's a whole history of violence that we're only starting to understand now.
Yeah, maybe. It's a sobering thought, for sure. It reminds us that sometimes the darkest parts of human nature are even bigger than we think.
And that brings us back to that question, why? What would make someone do these things, seemingly out of nowhere? We've talked about some of the things criminologists think about. But is there anything about Malveau's case specifically that stands out to you?
Well, one thing that I find really interesting is that his crimes didn't really seem to escalate. He went from a seemingly normal life to committing murder. There's no, like, documented history of him committing smaller crimes first. Like, he didn't gradually become more violent.
So it's like this sudden burst of darkness.
Right, exactly. And that's what makes his case so strange. It challenges the way we think about how these behaviors develop. It makes you question if we can really predict human nature.
We're almost out of time for this part of our deep dive. What do you think is the biggest question we're left with about John Peter Malveaux?
I think for me, it's whether this darkness was always there inside of him, just waiting for the right time to come out, or if there were specific things that happened, like triggers that pushed him over the edge. It's a question that we might never really know the answer to, but it's definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah, there's still a lot of mystery surrounding this case, even though he confessed. We got a lot more to uncover, more to analyze. Join us for the final part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at the questions that are still unanswered and the impact that John Peter Malveau's crimes have had. All right, so we're back and we're continuing our deep dive into the really disturbing case of John Peter Malveaux. Over the last couple parts, we've been trying to understand the man behind the crimes.
Yeah, we've looked at his life in Opelousas, how normal it seemed, and then, of course, the brutality of his crimes, and we're still trying to figure out what his motivations might have been.
It feels like even with all the information we have, there are still so many unanswered questions. Questions that really make you think about, like, what makes people do these things?
Yeah, for sure. We know that he confessed. We know he was found guilty. But it still feels like we don't fully understand how far his crimes went or how deep that darkness inside him really was.
One of the things that I find most unsettling is that he was investigated for other crimes, but they could never conclusively link him to any of them.
Yeah, it's definitely possible that there are other victims out there, families who might never know what happened to their loved ones.
It makes you wonder about, like, the limits of the justice system. How many cases are out there that just, I don't know, fall through the cracks? How many stories go untold?
Right, and it also shows how important it is to keep investigating. Even when there's been a confession, there's always more to learn, more pieces of the puzzle to find.
So what can we do? I mean, how do we deal with all this uncertainty? How do we find out if there are more victims?
Well, there are a bunch of investigative techniques that can be used. For example, there are cold case units. They specialize in going back and looking at old cases. They use new technologies and different ways of investigating to try and uncover new leads. And there's always the possibility of using DNA profiling to see if they can connect Malveaux to any unsolved crimes.
So even though he's in prison, the investigation isn't necessarily over.
Right, exactly. Justice isn't just about punishing someone, it's also about finding the truth, giving people answers, and helping those who have been affected by these awful crimes to find some sense of closure.
And that brings us back to that big question. Why? Why would he do this? We've talked about a lot of potential factors, like his drinking, his issues with his church, the fact that he seemed to become violent so suddenly. Is there anything else, like from criminology or anything, that could help us understand his case better?
Well, there's this idea called the McDonald triad. It suggests that there might be a connection between certain behaviors in childhood, like bedwetting, setting fires, being cruel to animals, and those things being linked to violent behavior later in life. Now, it's really important to remember that this isn't a guarantee or anything, but it's a pattern that researchers have seen in some cases.
So, like, these things that might seem small when you're a kid, they could actually be warning signs.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, obviously, not every kid who does these things is going to grow up to be violent, but it's definitely something that criminologists look at when they're trying to figure out how people end up committing these kinds of crimes.
It makes you think about how important it is to, step in early, to try to help kids who are showing these behaviors in a positive and supportive way.
Absolutely. Recognizing those potential risk factors and doing something about them can make a huge difference in a child's life.
It's a reminder that preventing these things from happening is just as important as punishing people after they've happened.
I agree. It's about making our communities safer and healthier for everyone, and remembering that these issues are complicated and there's no easy fix.
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've really gotten into the details of John Peter Malveau's crimes, tried to understand his psychology, and wrestled with those big questions that still surround his case.
We've talked about his plea deal, the possibility of more victims, and the ongoing effort to find out the truth.
What do you think is the most important thing we could take away from all of this?
I think for me, it's that you never really know where evil is hiding. Malveaux was just a normal guy, a family man. People in his community respected him. And his case really forces us to reconsider what we think a criminal looks like. It makes you realize that evil can hide behind a very ordinary face.
It's a chilling thought, and it reminds us that we need to be aware, trust our gut feelings, and speak up if we see something that doesn't seem right.
Exactly.
This case also shows how important it is to keep researching and investigating what makes serial killers tick. The more we understand about why they do these awful things, the better chance we have of stopping it from happening again.
I couldn't agree more. The more we know, the more we can do to protect people.
So if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the sources we used for this deep dive. Malveaux's Wikipedia page and the newspaper articles from back then are a good place to start. They offer a really interesting, although pretty disturbing, look into the mind of a killer.
And remember, even though this case is closed, the conversation isn't over. We should always keep searching for the truth and trying to understand these things better.
Thanks for joining us on this difficult but really important journey. We'll leave you with this. Don't underestimate the power of the ordinary. It can hide darkness. It can be a shield for evil. So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.